Before he rocked the foundations of science, Charles Darwin was mostly good at one thing: disappointing expectations. Born into money in 1809 in Shrewsbury, England, Darwin was a textbook upper-class dilettante in a stiff-collared world that valued status over spirit. His grandfather was the famed naturalist Erasmus Darwin, and his father, a wealthy, intimidating doctor, had no patience for Charles's lazy whims or insect obsessions. In fact, by the time young Charles was supposed to be mapping out a career, his main accomplishments were flunking out of medical school in Edinburgh and collecting beetles with the obsessive energy of a Victorian Pokemon trainer. It's easy to forget just how unimpressive Darwin seemed at first. He had no great ambitions. He was soft-spoken, easily distracted, more interested in shooting birds than dissecting them. And when he dropped out of medicine, because the sight of surgery made him physically ill, his father famously snapped, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family."
Ouch.
So what do you do with a wealthy, underachieving young man in 1820s England who doesn't know what to do with himself? You send him into the church. Not because he was especially religious, he wasn't, but because becoming a rural clergyman was the polite off-ramp for wayward gentlemen. It was a soft landing, complete with a cozy rectory, a garden, and plenty of leisure time for natural pursuits. It would have been a quiet life, full of sermons, bird-watching, and family dinners. But Darwin was stalling. Even as he enrolled at Cambridge to prepare for holy orders, he was far more invested in geology field trips and drunken bug hunts with friends than any spiritual awakening. His professors, however, noticed something. Not that he was brilliant, but that he had a strange, dogged curiosity. He didn't just collect things, he obsessed over them. Patterns, differences, behaviors. His mind wandered to the why behind the what. And in one of the strangest twists of fate in scientific history, that curiosity got him noticed by a professor named John Henslow, who would quietly open a door that would change everything. Enter the HMS Beagle, a British naval survey ship about to embark on a multi-year voyage to chart South America and the South Pacific. The ship's captain, Robert Fitzroy, wanted not just a naturalist, but a gentleman companion. Someone who could offer intelligent conversation and wouldn't mutiny. Henslow, seeing something in Darwin, recommended him for the spot. It wasn't an obvious yes. Darwin's father hated the idea. 5 years at sea was a waste of time, and the family had no intention of letting Charles disappear into some amateur science boondoggle. But Charles begged. He lobbied an uncle to intervene. And in a moment of resignation, or maybe rare insight, his father relented. So Darwin packed up, barely 22 years old, with no published work, no grand vision, no idea what he was walking into. He wasn't leaving to change the world. He was trying to avoid a life of sermons and small-town respectability. And just like that, the future father of evolution boarded a ship that would sail into storms, jungles, revolutions, and his own breakdowns, and in the process, he'd find something that would keep him awake for the rest of his life. If Charles Darwin had known what he was actually signing up for when he stepped aboard the HMS Beagle in 1831, he might have politely backed away, gone home, and married a cousin early. What he thought would be a 2-year gentleman's cruise turned into a 5-year odyssey that pushed his body to its limits, tore apart his worldview, and oh, right, laid the groundwork for one of the most dangerous scientific ideas in history. Let's start with the obvious. Darwin was violently seasick. We're not talking a little nausea. We're talking chronic, debilitating waves of illness that plagued him for the entire voyage. The only reason he didn't jump overboard was because the real drama began when he actually got off the ship. Every time the Beagle docked, it was like opening the next chapter in an unhinged science fiction novel, with Darwin as the wide-eyed protagonist trying to make sense of an ecosystem, a culture, or a geological event he couldn't explain away with church-approved answers. The Beagle's mission was simple on paper: chart the coast of South America for the British Admiralty. But Darwin's mission quickly became something else entirely. From the volcanic hellscapes of the Andes to the pristine nightmare of the Galapagos Islands, what Darwin saw out there didn't match the biblical order he'd grown up believing in. Instead, he found nature raw, chaotic, violent, improvisational. And that shook him. In Brazil, he witnessed slavery up close, something he had strongly opposed in theory, but which now became viscerally, horrifyingly real. He recorded scenes of cruelty that left him furious and shattered, marking the first time his science began to tangle deeply with morality. In Argentina, he uncovered the fossilized bones of extinct mammals so enormous and bizarre that they looked like pranks of creation. Sloths the size of cars, armadillos as big as bathtubs, all lying just beneath the surface of the earth. Why would God create entire species just to let them vanish? The answers weren't in the Bible, and Darwin knew it. And then came Chile. On February 20th, 1835, a massive earthquake struck near Valdivia. Darwin witnessed entire landscapes shift in front of his eyes. Coastlines rose, mountains trembled, islands moved. He began to suspect that the earth wasn't shaped by sudden cataclysms, but by slow, relentless forces grinding over millions of years. That may sound boring today, but in 1835, it was heretical. Every rock, every fossil, every island became a clue, and Darwin was quietly, obsessively piecing them together. But it wasn't until the Beagle arrived in the Galapagos Islands that Darwin's worldview truly began to implode. At first glance, the islands looked like a volcanic wasteland, but up close, they were a living laboratory. He found birds that looked almost identical, yet had radically different beaks depending on which island they came from. Giant tortoises, with subtle shell variations. Lizards that swam. The natural order wasn't neat and fixed, it was messy, flexible, adaptable. Species weren't designed for their environments. They responded to them. They changed. It's easy to imagine Darwin staring at a bird and having some grand epiphany, but it didn't happen that way. He didn't even realize the significance of the finches until he got home and other scientists pointed it out. What mattered was that his mind was now swimming in contradictions. He had gone out a believer in divine design. He was coming back with something dark, revolutionary, and terrifying lurking just beneath his polished, gentlemanly exterior. The idea that life was not governed by divine blueprint, but by struggle, randomness, and death. Emotionally, Darwin was unraveling. His health deteriorated. He became isolated on the ship, lost in his notebooks. He wrote to friends about his fears and confusion. This wasn't just a voyage, it was a psychological metamorphosis. He left England as a curious young man. By the time he returned, he was a ticking time bomb of heretical ideas. The voyage of the Beagle ended in 1836, but for Darwin, the real journey was just beginning. He had hundreds of pages of notes, thousands of specimens, and one agonizing question building in his brain. What if everything we believe about life is wrong? By the time Charles Darwin stepped off the HMS Beagle in 1836, he wasn't the same man who had boarded it. His body was wrecked, his journals were stuffed with revelations he could barely comprehend, and something deep inside him, something stubborn and private, had begun to calcify. He didn't say it out loud, not yet. But he knew. The living world didn't look like a divinely ordered zoo anymore. It looked like a blood-soaked arena of survival, randomness, and quiet extinction. He had seen the skeletons. He had watched the earthquakes. He had stared into the eyes of animals that existed nowhere else on Earth. And somehow, in the space between those wild beaks and fossilized bones, he saw a pattern. And it scared him. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt so terrifyingly right. So what does he do? He goes home, marries his cousin, and locks his theory in a drawer. Literally. Let's back up. Darwin wasn't a reckless iconoclast. He was a careful, anxious man born into a class that prized good manners over bold moves. And what he'd stumbled onto, natural selection, wasn't just a new theory. It was a grenade with the pin barely hanging in. If species evolved through competition and adaptation over millions of years, then there was no need for divine design. No Garden of Eden. No perfect creation. Just nature read in tooth and claw, working blindly and without mercy. That idea wasn't just controversial, it was cultural dynamite. So Darwin buried it. Instead of publishing, he did what a Victorian gentleman was expected to do. He got married to his first cousin Emma Wedgwood, bought a country estate in Kent, and started raising a family. Outwardly, it was the quiet, respectable life. Inwardly, he was unraveling. He turned his study at Down House into a kind of scientific bunker. He collected barnacles for 8 years. Not because he was obsessed with barnacles, though he eventually became the world's leading expert, but because it gave him a socially acceptable excuse to avoid publishing the theory that haunted him. He cataloged, he diagrammed, he obsessed over minute differences between mollusks, birds, plants. All the while, he was building a mountain of proof. Quietly, compulsively. But why the delay? Why sit on the biggest idea in biology for 2 whole decades? The answer is complicated and deeply human. First, he was afraid, not just of ridicule or professional failure, but of destroying everything he held sacred. His wife, Emma, was deeply religious. Darwin feared his theory would not only scandalize the church, but wound her personally. Their letters show a painful intimacy. He confided in her, confessed his doubts, tiptoed around her beliefs. He loved her, and he dreaded the idea of hurting her. Second, Darwin wasn't a rebel by nature. He was methodical, borderline obsessive, and terrified of getting it wrong. He wanted the theory to be airtight. He wanted mountains of evidence, not just fragments. In a way, the long delay was a symptom of perfectionism, the need to armor his idea against every possible attack. And third, there was the psychological weight of it all. Darwin didn't want to become the man who killed God in polite society. He was uncomfortable with fame, terrified of controversy, and physically fragile. His health deteriorated after the Beagle. He suffered from chronic vomiting, insomnia, heart palpitations, and full-on nervous collapses. Was it a mysterious tropical illness? Psychosomatic guilt? The result of suppressing an idea too heavy to carry alone? We still don't know. What we do know is that Darwin spent 20 years writing and rewriting the theory of natural selection, alone, in secret, like a man building a bomb he might never detonate. And then, in the summer of 1858, the letter arrived. It was from a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, writing from the Malay archipelago. In it, Wallace described a theory of evolution that was almost word for word what Darwin had been keeping in his drawer. Wallace had never seen Darwin's work. He had figured it out independently. Suddenly, Darwin wasn't just a secret heretic. He was about to be scooped. The bomb was no longer just his. And ready or not, the clock had started ticking. It came in a plain envelope, posted from the steamy edge of the known world, the Dutch East Indies. Inside was a polite, handwritten letter from a young British naturalist Darwin barely knew, a man named Alfred Russel Wallace. At first glance, it seemed harmless. Wallace had been out in the tropics collecting specimens, battling malaria, and thinking big thoughts about life and nature. He wanted to know what Darwin thought of his new theory. Then Darwin started reading, and his stomach dropped. Wallace's letter laid out, in eerily precise language, the theory that Darwin had been quietly, obsessively shaping for 20 years. Natural selection. The survival of the fittest. Species evolving through competitive struggle. Tiny advantages stacking up over generations. The exact mechanism Darwin had discovered and locked away. Only now someone else had figured it out. Independently, boldly, and he was ready to publish. To anyone else, Wallace's letter would have seemed flattering, maybe even inspiring. But for Darwin, it read like a bomb threat, because Wallace had no idea Darwin had already written tens of thousands of words on the subject. And in the unforgiving world of 19th century science, ideas didn't belong to the person who thought of them first. They belonged to the person who published them first. Darwin panicked. In one of the most intense periods of his life, he wrote to friends and mentors in despair. All my originality, whatever it may amount to, he confessed, will be smashed. Worse, he wasn't just worried about being scooped, he was grieving. Just weeks earlier, Darwin's young son Charles Waring had died of scarlet fever. The house was cloaked in mourning, his wife Emma was devastated, and now this scientific catastrophe had landed on his doorstep. Enter 2 of Darwin's oldest allies, the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker and the geologist Charles Lyell. These weren't just colleagues, they were Darwin's scientific godfathers. They knew what was at stake, and they moved quickly to protect his legacy without humiliating Wallace. The solution was controversial, but elegant. They would stage a joint presentation at the Linnean Society in London. Darwin's unpublished writings, some dating back to the 1830s, would be read aloud alongside Wallace's new paper, establishing Darwin's priority and crediting Wallace as a co-discoverer. There was just one problem. Darwin wasn't there. Too grief-stricken to attend, he stayed at home while two quiet, unassuming papers were read aloud on July 1st, 1858. No fireworks, no crowd eruption, no immediate backlash. In fact, nothing happened. One scientist in attendance later remarked that the meeting had produced no striking results. The revolution had begun with a whimper, but Darwin understood what was coming. He knew that if he didn't act fast, if he didn't lay out his theory in full, his life's work would be remembered as a footnote, or worse, as an unfinished idea hijacked by someone else. So he raced. For 13 straight months, Darwin wrote as if possessed. Not the technical, cautious notes of his early years, but a full, readable book, a narrative argument for evolution that the public could grasp. It would be called On the Origin of Species, and it was less a scientific treatise than a carefully detonated intellectual bomb. He knew what to emphasize: the slow, gradual process of change, the overwhelming evidence from nature, the dignity and wonder of a law-bound universe. But he also knew what not to say. Darwin avoided direct discussion of human evolution. He mentioned the Creator once, vaguely. He offered no blueprint for the soul. It was a Trojan horse of a book, quiet on the outside, but world-shaking at its core. When Origin was finally published on November 24th, 1859, it sold out on the first day. Scientists, priests, radicals, and aristocrats all scrambled to get their hands on it. Some read it in shock, others in awe. The reviews rolled in: blasphemous, brilliant, dangerous, inevitable. One bishop famously sneered, "The book is like a pistol shot. It will be heard through the world." And it was. Overnight, Darwin went from a recluse with stomach issues to the most controversial man in the empire. Some called him a genius. Others called him a monster. Debates broke out in universities, pulpits, and drawing rooms. Atheists hailed him. Clergy condemned him. And poor Alfred Russel Wallace? He faded into the margins, not quite forgotten, but clearly second place in a race he hadn't realized he was running. Darwin didn't steal the theory, but he owned it. And now there was no going back. He had broken the spell. He had named the mechanism. And he had done the one thing he had avoided for decades. He told the world. When On the Origin of Species hit bookstores in 1859, it didn't just land with a thud, it detonated. For 20 years, Charles Darwin had kept his theory close, massaging the data, fearing the fallout. Now, the intellectual bomb he had been quietly building in his country garden had gone off in the middle of Victorian society. And for many people, the blast wasn't just scientific. It was spiritual warfare. The first wave of backlash came fast, furious, and very well-dressed. Anglican bishops denounced the book from pulpits. Conservative scientists sneered at its unproven hypotheses. For the devout, the problem wasn't that Darwin was wrong, it was that he might be right. If species evolved slowly through natural selection, then God didn't design each creature perfectly in his image. Humans weren't created as flawless beings in a paradise garden. We were just lucky animals, scrappy survivors, slightly improved apes. And nobody in Victorian England wanted to be told they were cousins with a chimpanzee. Darwin himself stayed mostly silent. He didn't do interviews. He didn't defend himself in public debates. He didn't even attend the most infamous battle over his theory, the 1860 Oxford evolution debate. That stage was held by his bold and brilliant bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley was a scientist with the soul of a prizefighter. At Oxford, he went toe-to-toe with the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, who attempted to dismantle Darwin's theory with a mix of mockery and scripture. According to legend, Wilberforce sneered and asked whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side. Huxley's reply? Cool, measured, and devastating. I would rather be descended from an ape than a man who misuses his talents to obscure the truth. The room exploded, and just like that, evolution had its champion. Outside the lecture halls, the debate turned surreal. Satirical cartoons flooded newspapers. Darwin was drawn with an ape's body and his own unmistakable beard, labeled the Monkey Man. Priests clutched pearls. Poets mourned the soul's disappearance. Queen Victoria reportedly found the book interesting but unconvincing. But for young intellectuals, artists, and radicals, Darwin was electric. He had cracked open the universe and shown it to be fluid, dangerous, and alive. The church, for its part, wasn't monolithic in its response. Some religious thinkers tried to reconcile evolution with theology, arguing that natural selection was simply the tool God used. Others declared Darwinism more dangerous than any gunpowder plot, a direct attack on the sanctity of man, order, and divine will. The Catholic Church would eventually condemn Darwinism explicitly. Even Emma Darwin, his wife, wrestled with the spiritual cost of her husband's ideas. She had prayed he wouldn't go too far. Now he had gone all the way, and through it all, Darwin stayed at Down House, quietly watching the firestorm he had unleashed from behind the curtain. He never said survival of the fittest. That phrase came from philosopher Herbert Spencer. He never claimed evolution proved atheism. He didn't have to. The implications were obvious, and they spread like a virus. God had competition now, and his rival was natural law. But here's the strange twist. While Darwin became a lightning rod, he was never a provocateur. He wasn't Nietzsche. He wasn't Marx. He didn't crave revolution. He believed in slow, steady change, both in nature and in people. And ironically, that was exactly what happened. The backlash, for all its fury, began to morph. Younger scientists embraced Darwinism. Fields like anthropology, genetics, and psychology began to grow roots in evolutionary thinking. Even the opposition started to fragment. Over time, Darwin's theory wasn't a fringe idea anymore. It was a movement, a paradigm shift, a new lens through which the entire natural world was viewed. By the 1870s, Darwin was no longer a scientific outlaw. He was an icon. And yet, the toll was real. He remained plagued by illness, often bedridden, frequently anxious. He continued to refine his ideas, writing follow-ups on everything from orchid reproduction to the expressions of human emotion. He never stopped working, but he never stopped worrying either. The impact of his theory had far exceeded his own appetite for conflict. Darwin had wanted to explain life. Instead, he'd become a symbol for everything the modern world feared and needed to understand. When Charles Darwin died on April 19, 1882, he wasn't dragged to the grave as a heretic. He wasn't burned in effigy. He wasn't buried quietly in the countryside to avoid scandal. He was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, just a few feet from Sir Isaac Newton. Let that sink in. The man who had once feared that his theory might destroy his reputation, his marriage, and his legacy was now being entombed alongside Britain's greatest minds, beneath the vaulted ceilings of England's most sacred scientific shrine. The church that once balked at his ideas now made space for his bones. The nation that once mocked him with monkey cartoons now gave him a funeral fit for royalty. But the burial didn't close the book. If anything, it cracked it wide open. Darwin's death didn't end the debate. It cemented him as the central figure in one of the most enduring intellectual battles of the modern age. Because Darwin wasn't just a scientist anymore. He had become a symbol, a cipher into which every culture, ideology, and era projected its fears and fantasies about human nature. Almost immediately, Darwin's theory began to mutate, not biologically, but politically. Some twisted it into justification for empire and racism, arguing that survival of the fittest meant white Europeans were naturally superior. Darwin himself never said anything of the sort. His writings are cautious, even empathetic toward indigenous peoples, but others were happy to weaponize evolution in the service of social control. The term social Darwinism emerged, and it became a convenient excuse for everything from ruthless capitalism to colonial conquest. Eugenics soon followed, and with it, an entire century of horror in Darwin's name. Across the Atlantic, the United States would become the next major battlefield. In 1925, Darwin's ideas were put on trial, literally. The Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee pitted modern science against biblical creationism in a courtroom that turned into a circus. The drama was electric. Lawyers quoting Genesis, scientists quoting Origin, newspapers turning evolution into a front-page showdown between God and reason. And even though it ended in a guilty verdict for teaching evolution, the long-term momentum shifted. Darwin wasn't going anywhere. Fast forward through the 20th century, genetics proved him right. DNA confirmed what Darwin could only speculate. Natural selection wasn't just a theory, it was a force you could trace at the molecular level. Evolution became the bedrock of modern biology, a unifying theory that explained everything from antibiotic resistance to the tailbones we carry in our skeletons like evolutionary souvenirs. But even as science embraced Darwin, the culture wars kept resurrecting the ghost of that modest man from Downhouse. Evolution became a shorthand for modernity itself, progressive, godless, often misunderstood. For some, Darwin was a hero who freed us from superstition. For others, he was a villain who unmoored morality from divine authority. Textbooks were rewritten. Court cases raged. School boards became ideological minefields. And the arguments weren't just religious. Philosophers, psychologists, even AI researchers began wrestling with Darwin's implications. If life is shaped by blind forces and not cosmic purpose, what does that mean for consciousness? For free will? For love? Art? War and peace? Can we program evolution into machines? Can we out-evolve evolution itself? Darwin never lived to see these questions, but his fingerprints are all over them. His face is on money. His name is on hundreds of streets, institutions, awards. He's been sculpted, lionized, mocked, banned, burned in effigy, and taught in classrooms from Nairobi to Nebraska. His image, gaunt, bearded, haunted, has become so iconic it feels less like a person and more like a myth. But here's the secret. Darwin never wanted to be a myth. He wanted to be right. He was a man who hated conflict, feared controversy, and delayed his life's work out of love for his wife and terror of being misunderstood. And yet, he changed the world not by shouting, but by watching, by collecting, by thinking, and by finally, reluctantly, saying something so simple and so devastating that we still haven't stopped arguing over it. Things change. Life adapts. Nothing stays the same. So now, more than 140 years after his death, Charles Darwin remains what he always was, an accidental revolutionary. Not a prophet, not a villain, just a quiet man with a radical idea, one that refused to stay buried with him.